Okay, I think that's just come across. I've got that message as well. So everything what I can see is nodding to that. So we're going to start first with Amanda Mulligan, who's going to talk about this first section around the policy history. So Amanda's at the Ministry for Culture and Heritage. She's the Senior Policy Advisor in Heritage Policy. So ka nui te mihi kia koe, Amanda. And sorry, just before that, Amanda, I did one thing I was meant to do, which was just to show a slide. Taiho, we will just put that up and select a window and a slide and a share. Sorry, we're just getting driving instructions here and that. So there's the agenda for today. Sorry, and I just introduced Amanda, and then of course we'll have Jamie Jacobs and then Kieran Pollock, and then we'll have that Q&A at the end. So there's our agenda for today, but I'll hand over to Amanda and stop sharing and hopefully segue nicely to you, Amanda. Kia ora, Amanda.
Kia ora, Dean. Kia ora tātou. I am going to do the same, attempt to share some slides. So I'm just here to deliver a little bit of a history and sort of how we got to today's session on the policy. So back in 2004, Cabinet approved this policy that you see on your screen, the Policy for Government Departments Management of Historic Heritage, and that had some high-level principles and policies to guide best practice management of departments' heritage places. But even with the policy in place, some significant places in government stewardship were lost, or sometimes they were not being appropriately cared for. So the ministry in 2009 and in 2019, which was how I initially joined the ministry, I was on secondment here, they did some reviews in those years and found that some non-compliance by departments was largely due to simply a lack of knowledge or understanding of the policy and the general principles of heritage conservation that it's based on. Also, a lack of a systemic approach to property management in some departments, and of course budgetary pressures, which meant that spending on cultural heritage sometimes wasn't prioritised. And the two reviews that the ministry undertook in 2009 and 2019 led to recommendations to update the content of the policy to reflect best practice for the management of heritage places, to expand the policy to cover all state sector agencies, not just departments, and to improve the promotion of the policy and monitor it through reporting. So in November of last year, Cabinet agreed to a new policy, which is now the Policy for Government Management of Cultural Heritage Places. It came into effect on the 1st of February this year, and we at MCH published guidance, which is available on our website in the same month. So there were some things that were noted by Cabinet in November 2022, which were that MCH will stage implementation of the policy by agencies so that agencies can plan to integrate it into their property management processes, including the costs that arise from implementing the policy. Cabinet also noted that some agencies will need to seek additional funding through future budget cycles or to reprioritise from their baseline to enable them to fully implement the policy. And Cabinet also noted that the Ministry for Culture and Heritage will be responsible for promoting awareness of the policy, supporting it to be implemented with guidance and access to expert advice, and working with the agencies that are subject to the policy to put in place a reporting framework that's practical and achievable. So I guess the promoting awareness of the policy and supporting implementation side of things brings us to today's session. It's part of the Ministry for Culture and Heritage's mandate, and we are very lucky to have our colleagues from Heritage New Zealand delivering these webinars. So to support the implementation with guidance and access to experts like Heritage New Zealand. So that is the brief potted background to the webinar sessions, and I'll hand back to you, Dean.
Kia ora, Amanda, thank you for that. Great, we've got our screen back there. Now we're going to go over to you, Jamie. Kia ora, Jamie, Director of the Central Region for Pouhere Taonga, Heritage New Zealand. Ka nui te mihi ka koe.
Kia ora koutou, I'm really happy to be here, and let me just share my screen and hopefully get it right. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. I'm sure there's a lot of questions about how do you even go about considering heritage properties that you may have in your portfolios. So hopefully you'll leave here a little bit wiser and certainly know where you can get some information from us. So the first section is heritage values definition, identification, assessment. First thing to think about is, what are heritage values? Heritage values are the set of meanings that contribute to the significance of a heritage place. Heritage values can be tangible or intangible. This is, an important thing. Intangible heritage has become a very important part of heritage conservation worldwide. Although heritage values tend to be intangible, they are often linked to very tangible places, whether the natural landscape or to built heritage or place-based heritage. Heritage values are identified using an established and ideally uniformly applied set of criteria, and I'll be talking about this a little bit later. And although the specific definitions of criteria and their number vary from place to place and system to system, heritage values and their determining criteria were remarkably consistent globally. I've spent the first part of my career in the United States, and we only have 4 criteria that are commonly used for evaluating things, whereas you'll see we have 10 for parts of our assessment at Heritage New Zealand. So the New Zealand Heritage List, Rārangi Kōrero, or often just called the list. So we oversee the list. Our Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Act 2014 establishes us as the maintainer of the list. The list is Aotearoa New Zealand's official national record of our rich and diverse place-based heritage. And you often hear the term place-based heritage. Again, this can be, this is typically often buildings, but doesn't always have to be. It could be sites and landscapes as well. The Historic Places Act 1980 established the first National Register of Historic Places, Historic Areas, and Traditional Sites, which has evolved to become the current list. If you have a lot of interest in the history of the list, we've got some staff here who can tell you a lot about it. There are 6,000 places recognized as heritage on the list, and this complements the thousands of other places recognized through heritage schedules and district plans and under the Resource Management Act 1991. So the New Zealand Heritage List, again, the list is a professionally researched, analyzed, and written record of place-based heritage. I think this is really important because sometimes we have some comments or critiques where it's sort of like, well, we just sit down and decide what might be eligible to be on the list, or we pick our favorite places. But it's just to really establish that the list is backed by these very deeply researched and analyzed reports that make a case for entering something on the list and then deciding which category it should be at. The list is a dynamic, evolving, and diversifying resource that is continually expanding in its scope, stories, and representation. We often get asked about the list and let's say the number of Māori sites, for example, which admittedly is quite low, and our strategic priorities are working to rectify that. But some people think that maybe we should think about deaccessioning things from the list, when in reality a more better way to think about it is just adding to the list and letting it represent the nation as it changed over time. So we're constantly changing, not only adding new places and stories to the list, but also reviewing and adding new stories to existing places on the list. So it's a very dynamic thing. And taken as a whole, the list is an invaluable taonga that documents the changes in how society sees heritage over time. So the purpose of the list, according to the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Act 2014, is to inform the public and notify owners about New Zealand's heritage places, and to be a source of information for the purposes of the Resource Management Act 1991. That sort of distills it to its very statutory kind of roles. It should be noted that the backing information for the New Zealand Heritage List is recognized as being particularly solid by things like the Environment Court. So what types of heritage places are on the list? So there are 5 types, well, yep, 6 types, sorry, if you include areas. So you have historic places. So 2 types of historic places. One is a category 1, which has special or outstanding historical or cultural value, and category 2, which has historical or cultural significance or value. So it's special or outstanding is the key modifier there. And what you see here is Athfield's house and office here in Wellington, spilling down the hillside as a Cat 1, and then Woodville School main block as a Cat 2. I'll talk a little bit more about the categories a little bit later and begin to let you think about how we might assess whether or not something should be a Cat 1 or Cat 2 as they're commonly known. Historic areas are just a group of related historic places, such as a geographical area with a number of properties or sites, a heritage precinct, or a historical and cultural area. Often historic areas are best known within cities, particularly neighborhoods, but they can be all sorts of things. In this case, it's Bearing Head, Oruia, Puani historic area here at Bearing Head. So what types of heritage places are on the list? Again, we have 3 types of Māori heritage places: Wahitapu areas, and Wahitupuna. And I'll talk a little bit more about them right now. It should be noted that iwi and hapu determine significance for Wahitapu areas, and Wahitupuna. And that work is overseen by our Māori heritage team, Te Tira, here at Heritage New Zealand. But according to the Act, Wahitapu means a place sacred to Māori in the traditional, spiritual, religious, ritual, or mythological sense, and a Wahitapu area means land that contains 1 or more Wahitapu, so much like a historic area. Wahitupuna have defined criteria. That place must have strong traditional associations with 1 or more ancestors significant to an iwi or hapu, and be integral to the identity or cultural well-being of the iwi or hapu, and be a distinct and cohesive place or area. Great question. How do we choose what to assess? There's sort of 3 early stages. So either the public can make an application to Heritage New Zealand, which we prefer, or we might identify a place as being potentially a good candidate for the list. And it enters in the annual prioritization of these places. So we get a number of nominations, we sit down, the listing team will have a first go, and then we'll talk about it as a larger team, just about what our strategic priorities are, whether or not the place would likely meet our criteria, and sort of just doing the initial sift through kind of yes, no, maybe. And then eventually we will get to a point where we can say yes or no, and send information out to the people who are unsuccessful or that we don't think would be successful, and then in contrast, some notice to the people that we will eventually move forward with their proposal or the nomination for listing. And then they kind of they sit in a group. The pool of opportunities is what we typically call it in Central, until they're put on a work plan, and then there's an assessment done of the place, which I'll talk more about. Again, deciding whether or not it could be eligible for the list, as well as what level it should be at. And all of these things are done within our regional and area offices in Heritage New Zealand. So Section 66(1) of our Act provide assessment criteria for getting on the list. So these are 10 criteria: aesthetic, archaeological, architectural, cultural, historical, scientific, social, spiritual, technological, and traditional. They're explained in a very nice set of guidelines that we have, what they mean and how you apply them to particular places. Again, these are not much different from what you see worldwide and the way people approach places. So once you have one set of criteria for deciding whether or not they should be on the list, you have a second set of criteria, which is similar but not identical, that determines whether or not it should be a category 1, again, outstanding or special significance, or category 2, where it just has significance. So I'll read through these, but we'll talk a little bit more about them. It's important to sort of get a sense of how we approach the assessment criteria. So the extent to which a place reflects important or representative aspects of New Zealand history, the association of a place with events, persons, or ideas of importance in New Zealand history, the potential of a place to provide knowledge of New Zealand history. This is archaeology more succinctly, the potential of a place. So archaeology is looking at the future potential, or the ability of a place, if it was excavated in the future, to tell, to give you information about the past. And that's what they mean by potential. And I'll talk more about archaeology a little bit later. The importance of the place to tangata whenua, the community association with or public esteem for the place, the potential of the place for public education, whether it's through a museum or a house museum or a building museum, or just from use and visitation, the technical accomplishment value or design of the place, the symbolic or commemorative value of the place, the importance of identifying historic places known to date from an early period in New Zealand settlement, the importance of identifying rare types of historic places, and or the extent to which the place forms part of a wider historical and cultural area. So how do we design a category? So that's using the second set of criteria. So I'm just going to use a couple of examples that we have. To be honest, assigning a category for practitioners, heritage practitioners, is generally easy, but not always easy. That you do have ones that sit on the threshold, and I'll talk about that with one of the examples. Others are clearer. Usually you have a pretty good sense of where it should sit, but there is guidance, again, provided by Heritage New Zealand for this. This is the Church of the Immaculate Conception, built in 1880 in Pakipaki, which is it was built at the time of a papakaianga, Māori papakaianga, and is associated closely with Suzanne Aubert, who eventually came to Wellington and established the creche and the Home of Compassion. So this is a really important building to the very interesting and important story of Suzanne Aubert, but also very important to the community of Pakipaki. And we were able to form a very close relationship with them over the course of the project, which is actually yielding more additional work. But for its association with Suzanne Aubert and this community association, it's a category 1. Ashley Court Private Hotel. This is one of the last projects I worked on before I got the current role that I'm in. This one I'm showing, so this is in Newtown and Wellington, and I'm showing it because it was entered as a category 2 on the list originally, a very nice Edwardian building in Newtown, and we were asked to review the listing, which I'll talk about reviews a little bit later. And in the process of reviewing the listing, we found that while it was very much on a threshold, it eventually was confirmed as a category 1, in large part because of the really inventive way that it takes advantage of this wedge-like location on a major road moving south through Wellington, where the building has a really amazing prominence. So the report talks a lot about landscape design and urban landscape design, and how the building design took advantage of that, as well as its community esteem and the fact that basically the building has come to represent an entire neighborhood, and a historic neighborhood here in Wellington. The Chinese Mission Hall, and I'm using examples in Wellington because these are the ones that I'm most familiar with, but again, we operate throughout the entire country. This is the Chinese Mission Hall in Tearo. It's a Frederick de Jersey Clare building. He's a very important church architect, but it's the real major importance of this building is its association with the Chinese community when it formed in the 19th century in Wellington, and supporting those immigrants and those families living in Tearo at that time. So it was confirmed for those reasons as a Category 2. And just so we're not only looking at buildings, landscapes are very important. Here we have Manatū Ship Cove. This has been confirmed as a Category 1 place. Not probably what it would be 20 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, where it would be a monument to Cook. But Karen Pollack, who you'll be hearing from shortly, wrote a really fantastic report that paralleled a Wahitapu report by Artira, talking about really the first sustained European Māori interaction in Tōtaranui at Manatū, with Cook arriving and his fleet arriving at 4 different times over a relatively short, I think it was 5 years total. So this is the first documented exchange between Māori and Europeans that was, again, prolonged, like they would come back and they would reacquaint themselves. So I only put the first 6 from the report of the criteria it met, but it met almost all of them, I believe, or very close to them. So pretty amazing site, and it is being considered also for potential National Historic Landmark. Again, something I'll mention a little bit later, sorry. But to just give you an idea that landscape, so this includes the beach, most of the hillside that you can see, the water, as well as Motuara Island, which is kind of behind you in this image. And that island is the reason why, one of the reasons why Ship Cove is so interesting, is actually provide a barrier against storms and that sort of thing. So really interesting place, and very important as sort of one of the antecedents for biculturalism in New Zealand. So just getting back to my first slide, what are heritage values? I won't reread them, but it's just to get you sort of focused, because I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and also about how you might consider your own portfolios, which I use very neutrally, but we'll talk more shortly. So I just want to add, heritage values exist independent of whether or not they've been formally recognized. So they're not established only when you write a report. They exist even if not recognized. So it's just they're kind of inherent to a place, and that heritage values are not immediately apparent when visiting a site or looking at a photograph. Even places that are being valued for their aesthetic or their architectural reasons, it's not necessarily apparent the degree of their significance just by looking at it. So how do you go about figuring out what you have in terms of buildings and other built heritage? So I'm going to focus on heritage values are identified using an established and ideally uniformly applied set of criteria. And although the specific definitions of criteria and their number vary from place to place and system to system, heritage values and their determining criteria are remarkably consistent globally. So I'm going to just talk about three things, well, maybe 4, one that's not listed. So we have National Historic Landmarks, which is a new program in the 2014 Act here in New Zealand. So this is a recognition contained within our list. So it's not a separate list or a separate program, but it's a new level of significance. And it considers places having national, historical, physical, and/or cultural significance and a demonstration of broad community support, among other requirements. So these are really the places that, in the words of the program, that all New Zealanders should know about. That so the current, we have one current landmark, Waitangi, and we have a second working its way through the National War Memorial here in Wellington. So I work for National Landmarks in the United States, and I always like the term, these are places of transcendent national significance. So these are just places that rise above the level of mere national significance. So that just gives you an idea of where this sits. It is backed by our listing reports, but again, you have to demonstrate a kind of transcendent level and broad community support. There's also criteria in local authority heritage schedules. They can use their own criteria. Again, it's oftentimes similar to our criteria, or perhaps a simplified version of them. These schedules tend to include more places having local or regional significance, which would make sense because they're dealing with localities or regions. And then also you might want to also just think about in the back of your mind, World Heritage. These are outstanding universal values. World Heritage is run by UNESCO. A lot of World Heritage sites, particularly in New Zealand and in the United States, are natural sites rather than cultural sites. But again, you have to show an outstanding universal values across the globe, and using 10 criteria. And a lot of these have a degree of greater emphasis on scientific values like geography, geology, botany, and that sort of thing, sort of more than what your sort of sets of criteria used by Crown agencies or government agencies would have. So you've got this set of buildings in your, I'm going to call asset portfolio. I mean, it's as neutral as you can probably say it. So how do you start thinking about your heritage inventories and assessments, which is the first stage in caring for heritage buildings? First, you need to understand the extent of your portfolio. And the best way to go about this is to create a list of all built assets, buildings, objects, structures, including present and historic names. I'll be talking a little bit about land and landscape on the next slide, so I'm not forgetting it. So you create a list with the names and the dates of construction and major alterations, and note the physical qualities of these places generally and their general condition. Because these things, and you can use a chart, you could use a spreadsheet. This is pretty easy stuff. Typical sources for this level of work would be digital and hard copy facilities files, organizational files, and annual reports. And the effort, depending on the state of the files, is low to moderate, and it should be able to be completed by agency staff. This is essentially just pulling together some basic information about what you've got. So you've got this list. How do you identify potential heritage among your portfolio? And I'm just asking some questions to help kind of focus what you're thinking about at this stage. Were the buildings in the portfolio built specifically for the present day government entity? If yes, do they represent specific types or categories? Thinking about the Ministry of Education and schools. Did the buildings enter the portfolio after construction? So were they built for another reason and then they entered the ownership of the current Crown agency? And if yes, for what reasons? Was it just a convenient building to have in a good place, or was there a more particular reason? Typical sources, again, for this type of work would be digital and hard copy files, organizational files, and annual reports of either the current or previous owner. But also you might, Papers Past is a really good way to plug something in, at least for buildings built in the less recent past. And also this is the point where you might want to see if Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga and local authorities have reports and inventories that provide information about your properties. And again, the effort, depending on the state of the files, is probably moderate. And this is potentially completed by agency staff, but it's something that you might want to hire a consultant or heritage expert for. And the next stage will be understanding the principal context for assessing heritage. So you've got the basic information about the buildings, where you have a list, and then you have the basic information. And how do you kind of know what the context around the building? And so you're gathering information. One place at this stage you really want to be acknowledging iwi and hapu views and knowledge, either through consultation or partnership. You definitely want to be speaking to mana whenua in the area. And and just sort of assess, particularly if there's significant amounts of land, as well as sort of urban spaces and open spaces. You just don't want to think in terms of buildings themselves, and I'll talk about cultural landscapes a couple headers down. So you also want to do basic documentary research, so agency histories, secondary sources, and some primary and archival sources. So this would just be sort of a basic level of place-based history. But the effort level, while this would be relatively straightforward to a heritage consultant, it might be a moderate to high for the agency itself. So you might want to think about bringing in a heritage consultant at this point and doing the work. And assessing heritage within historical and cultural contexts. So now that you kind of have established what the main historical and cultural contexts are, you want to establish criteria for assessment. So you either say you're going to use Heritage New Zealand's criteria. I did a heritage assessment of the Milford Tract for DOC when I first got to New Zealand, and they used they didn't directly use the criteria from Heritage New Zealand, but they used a reduced amount. So they sort of gathered them, they grouped them under, I believe it was 4 basic criteria. So you could opt to do that. We would really encourage you to align it with a set of existing criteria rather than create your own criteria, but there's nothing to say that you can't create your own criteria. Based on your information gathering, which of the assets in your portfolio best represent the themes of the established historical and cultural contexts? And then which of the assets retains physical integrity? In the US, where I was educated and worked for the first part of my career, physical integrity was part of every listing at the national level. So you sort of had to assess the significance and then weigh that significance of the physical integrity. It does happen here, but the process isn't quite so spelled out as it is there. Integrity isn't condition. Integrity is the ability to convey the historical and cultural context. So a building may be in really poor condition, but it may have a high physical integrity that just is kind of getting lost between a lack of care. So condition really shouldn't put people off to whether or not something is an important heritage place. But physical integrity is something that you want to assess, and there's different ways to assess that, and we do explain that in our own guidelines as well. So built and natural landscapes and cultural landscapes. So I don't want to forget landscapes at all. Landscapes really have, in the last 25, 30 years, have become a very, very important part of heritage conservation and understanding heritage places. It means that we look at places not just as a building on a section in a city or sort of within a rural landscape. It's sort of looking at a larger, broader landscape of sort of the setting around the place. So you may have significant built and natural landscapes within these asset portfolios, and not just buildings. And particularly if there's iwi and hapu significance in the area, it would form potentially a cultural landscape. So which would be either built or natural features that form a sort of larger landscape of understanding and value. So not to think about just the buildings that you're dealing with, but think about the places that they're sitting in, the settings that they're in. And finally, I don't want to overlook archaeology. Archaeology is everywhere. Wherever you have a building, there's potential that you have, well, archaeology, but as far as archaeological sites, as defined in our Act, it's any pre-1900 area of settlement, either Māori or European. And these are protected places. So you need to be aware of whether or not they're archaeologically sensitive. If you're going to be doing any work on the buildings that includes excavation or disturbing the ground, you need to talk to archaeologists. It's best you hire an archaeologist to help consult with you on what's most appropriate. But in the first early cases, you can come talk to Heritage New Zealand. We can provide you some information about how you might proceed with an archaeological assessment or whether the archaeological sensitivity of the place. So I don't want you to be thinking just in terms of the buildings, but also you might have some significant archaeology beneath the ground and not visible. And also I'd like to just point out that remember that an agency's present-day mission and focus typically remains out of scope and has little to no bearing on the assessment of heritage values. This is even true of building, if the buildings were built for your agency in the past. I'm not degrading the mission, the present-day mission of the agencies, but you really want to be thinking about the context in which these places were created. To help you decide which are very important or not important. So that's just some general thinking about how you go about inventories. I'm just going to very quickly go through what happens to the New Zealand Heritage List process after the assessment. So this is after regional staff create a listing report. It goes to internal review at our national office and they respond back and changes are made. Then it goes to the Rārangi Kōrero Committee or the Māori Heritage Council if it's a wahi tapu, wahi tapu area, wahi tupuna. And they again either say, yes, it's ready to go forward to the board or it needs some more work and they provide some advice. So then there's a period of public notification where or agreement with owners and registered interests. So either it's publicly notified where there's a submission period, or if there's agreement with the owners or registered interest, they can just move forward without public notification. If we've identified a place to be considered for the list, it has to go through an independent assessment, which happens at this time. And then it ultimately goes to the Māori Heritage Council and or the board for confirmation to the list. So it's a fairly involved process, but pretty straightforward. And it reflects similar levels of review globally, really, for this type of work. Just a couple more things. The advantages of listing for owners. So it provides formal recognition of a place's historical or cultural value. It results in a comprehensive research report for owners and other interested parties. Can make a place eligible for funding. So private owners can apply to the National Heritage Preservation Incentive Fund, our fund, annually. Cat 1s and Cat 2s can apply if you're a private owner. If you're not a private owner, you can apply for lotteries for a similar type of funding. And we do provide support letters for that. Listing can lead to the inclusion of listed places in district plan heritage schedules. While listing does not provide direct protections, listing generally eventually leads to being scheduled in district plan heritage schedules, and we will typically submit favorably on that, and we'll advocate for these places to be protected in district plans. And it also enables access to free heritage advice, although admittedly we will give heritage advice to anybody with heritage. So entry on the list does not result in automatic protection, as I mentioned. It does not directly create regulatory or consequences or legal obligations on property owners. Our only statutory feature of our act has to do with archaeology and the protection of archaeological sites, which I've already discussed. Listing does not directly create specific rights or control over property, and it can occur without consultation with property owners, listing does not occur without consultation with property owners and affected parties. Our act requires us to consider the outlook of an owner when we're considering whether or not to put something on the list. Although I do note that there's not the owner doesn't have veto power, it's just that their opinion is considered by the board when confirming places for the list. And so just to I mentioned earlier that the list is kind of a diverse and ever-evolving thing. So improving the quality of the list, this is an important part of our work. This is done through reviews, which I've already mentioned. We can opt to do a review internally, or we're often asked to review something to have it taken off the list. Generally speaking, does not occur unless there's been a grievous loss of integrity since the time it was entered on the list. We also do information upgrades. So again, these are particularly for places that were on the list early that we have very little information. The information upgrades will just provide basic information, but also expand our knowledge of the context around that place. We do tech changes, which are basic changes about name, location, and that sort of thing. And we're always critically reviewing the nominations coming in against our strategic priorities, which at the current time are focused significantly on Māori heritage and increasing Māori representation in the list. So that is it for me. And now I'm going to pass to my colleague Karen Pollack to talk about the Crown land disposal process.
Kia ora koutou. I'm going to talk about Crown land disposal and heritage. So what is it? We're talking about the process by which Crown-owned land that is no longer needed is disposed of. This process is managed by Manatū Taonga, Land Information New Zealand, and we are consulted early in the process. So firstly, Manatū Taonga considers a number of matters. Is the land needed for other public works? Should it be offered back to the original owner or their successors? Is it required for treaty settlements? If not, any of these, it is sold on the open market. Before that happens, Heritage New Zealand is consulted. So our role is set out in a Cabinet Minute of 2007. It was amended a couple of times. This requires that all government departments disposing of land notify us so that we can assess the historic heritage values. As well as all government departments, there are some agencies that comply voluntarily, the most significant of which are Waka, Kotahi and Kāinga Ora. We provide an assessment of historic heritage values and we make recommendations based on a threshold of national interest. So it has to be pretty important for us to make a recommendation. Other agencies that are notified during this process include Kāinga Ora, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Conservation, sometimes local authorities. So along with historic heritage, other values that are considered before sale are natural and recreational values, and cultural significance to Māori is also considered. We will assess anything from slivers of land, and I mean slivers, to major building complexes. And as noted before, our assessment occurs before the land is disposed of or sold. So what do we do? Our first port of call is to check if the land and any buildings that are on it are listed anywhere that might suggest heritage. So we check to see whether it's on the New Zealand Heritage List, Ōrārangi Kōrero. We will also check whether it's scheduled as a heritage place in a local authority district plan. We will look to see if the land contains any recorded archaeological sites. We will see if it's in a statutory acknowledgement area, which as many of you I'm sure know is a treaty settlement process, and whether it contains any sites of significance to mana whenua. Each of our reports includes research on the land ownership and occupation, including development and building history. We will go back many, many centuries to cover successive tangata whenua occupation of the land. We will look to determine when it passed into Crown ownership. And we are always looking for evidence of pre-1900 human activity. And the reason that is important is because of our statutory role in protecting archaeological sites, which under our Act are any sites associated with pre-1900 human activity, whether or not they are officially recorded as archaeological sites or not. And I'll talk about that a bit more in the next slide. We have 20 working days to respond. This can be extended to 40 days on application by us. For the smaller places, it's usually extremely achievable in 20 working days, but sometimes if a site is particularly complex, we might need more time, and we will ask for that. And on that note, we really appreciate being given a heads up advanced notice if we are going to receive a large number, let's say 10, but depending on the complexity, maybe even 5 of notifications at one time. We only have one advisor who works full-time on CLDs based in our Auckland office. We have 2 other CLD advisors, one here in Wellington and another in the South Island, and they do this on a part-time basis. So we are a small crew, and thus we do appreciate advance notice. So if you either work in this field yourself or work with property agents who do, please be aware of this and talk to us. So after we've done our research, we will submit a report containing our findings. So that's our historical narrative and whether we deem it to be heritage, and any recommendations or advice notes. And we will submit that to the agent for the government department disposing of the land. So what happens if it's not heritage? Most of the land that goes through CLD process at our end is either not recorded as heritage in the ways that I mentioned earlier, or we don't believe in our expert opinion that it has heritage value to the level of national interest. So in these cases, we issue standard advisory notes. We will always recommend consultation with relevant hapu and iwi. We do not consult with mana whenua directly for CLDs. It's up to the department or agent to do this themselves, hence us just backing that up with a recommendation. We will always recommend that current and future owners are made aware of the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Archaeological Authority process, which I know will be the subject of a future webinar. So protecting archaeological sites associated with pre-1900 human activity, whether recorded or not, is one of our statutory roles. And so that's why our standard advice notes draw attention to the potential need for an archaeological authority from us to damage, destroy, or modify an archaeological site. Because if there is a verified history of pre-1900 activity, it's quite possible that there will be archaeological remnants at a subsurface level. It's important that people are aware of this. So when it's heritage, so that's either when it's, for instance, on the heritage list or a recorded archaeological site, the formal recognition measures I mentioned earlier, or if in our expert opinion, it meets the threshold for formal recognition. We have a range of measures that we can recommend, protection measures. Please note that our protection advice is non-binding. We can only make recommendations, although naturally we highly recommend that you follow our recommendations in order to protect our nation's heritage. So these are among the sort of typical measures that we might recommend. The first one, a heritage covenant, is a very powerful protection mechanism, which binds not only current but future owners to preserving and maintaining the place. This is entered on a record of title. It is negotiated between an owner and Heritage New Zealand and cannot happen if the owner does not agree. If it's not already on our heritage list, we will encourage a nomination and possibly scheduling in district plan. Other protection measures we may recommend is if we think retaining in Crown ownership is the best way of protecting the heritage values, we will recommend that. We might suggest that some site interpretation is erected so that people can understand the place's history and heritage values. If it contains a building which is likely to be used for a different purpose, we can provide some advice on what's called adaptive reuse. And we will also urge that information on the heritage, cultural and archaeological values are shared with prospective future owners so that they know what they are purchasing. Here are some examples of places that have come to us through the CLD process. This is the National Library of Palmerston North, built in 1967. We received a notification for this in 2018. It had no formal heritage recognition, but our expert advisor determined that it had architectural, historical and social heritage significance using the criteria that Jamie spoke about earlier. Our recommendations were that it be nominated to us for listing and that a heritage covenant be placed on the title. We're still waiting for the nomination, but a covenant was put on the title in 2019 when it was still in Crown ownership. It was sold to a private owner in 2021. They were fully aware of the heritage value in the covenant, and we have subsequently given that new owner free conservation advice. This is the Balclutha Courthouse, built in 1926, and we received a notification for this in 2014. This building was scheduled as heritage in the Clutha district plan, but not on our heritage list. We found that it had aesthetic, architectural and historical heritage significance, and we recommended that it be nominated for entry on our list, which occurred in 2015 when it was still owned by the Crown. It was sold to a private owner in 2016, and again we have provided them with free conservation advice. This example is a bit different to most of the notifications that we receive. This is Jacobs River School in Westland. It's a pretty typical small country school which closed in 2012. It's got a range of buildings on the site, the oldest of which dates from 1894. When we started research, we noted that it was adjacent to Māori Reserve land and that the Manatū River, or Jacobs River, is a statutory acknowledgement under the Ngāi Tahu Claims Settlement Act 1998. So those were real signals that this place was likely to have heritage value. Normally, as I said earlier, we don't consult with iwi hapu, but in this case, we soon realised that this was necessary to have a full understanding of the place, and we asked for permission to consult, which was duly granted. And we discovered that this school had been a central focal point for the Makawhio hapu for many generations, and that they had assumed a sense of ownership of the school and site. So one of the recommendations we made was that, well, the recommendation we made was that direct consultation be undertaken with Te Runanga or Makawhio to ascertain their interest in the place, which occurred. And it was really great that the Runanga purchased it in 2014. So now the community truly does have ownership of the site. And that is the end of my presentation. Kia ora.
So I'll hand over to one of my colleagues to read out the questions.
Kia ora. Thank you, Kieran. Thank you very much for that. And that's that really important process around Crown land disposal. Often, like that last example of giving back to community and reconnecting them. So yeah, it's great to hear about how that works in terms of I guess negotiating those spaces between community and the Crown. Ngā mihi. Yeah, we've got some questions which I'll read out. And then I'll direct them to who might be able to give you an answer. So the first one here is, are the assessment reports that supported a building to be listed publicly available? If so, how do I access them? So maybe, I guess, Jamie, you might be able to answer that.
Yes, so the information is available through the list online. So the basic information on our new website, you can, I don't believe that the PDFs are available online, but you can request them from staff. Karen, is that fair?
Yeah, that's correct. Jamie alluded earlier to the fact that we have, our list has a long history and lineage, and information requirements have changed dramatically over time. So you may often find, if you come to our list and you are looking at a place that was listed in the 1980s, there won't be much information, which we appreciate is frustrating. We find it frustrating too. We do retrospectively go back to update that information. But regardless of the amount of information on a place, you can be assured that it met the criteria for listing at the time and met the thresholds. And we're very happy in those situations to see if we can pull together some more detailed information to support the heritage listing if that information is not available on our website.
Ka pai. Thank you. The next question, does the Kamos Charter link with the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga criteria, or is it a separate method of establishing criteria?
I guess that's
Jamie?
probably me.
Yeah.
So the Kamos Charter 2010 is sets out principles of heritage conservation really as a best practice document that helps guide heritage conservation professionals within New Zealand. It's not criteria per se, but it does provide guidance for how we give heritage advice for things that are on the list. So when we get asked whether or not changes can be made, it helps it is used by our own conservation advisors to help form their advice for how we go about helping owners decide what to do or not to do. Amanda, you might have more to say on the topic.
I'm not sure. So I think the only thing I would add is that the charter doesn't really have criteria in it. It has I guess similar to the Resource Management Act and similar to the Heritage New Zealand Act. It has a list of ways that a place might have cultural heritage value, architectural, spiritual, social, etc., etc.
Yeah, so those attributes. Yeah. Ka pai. So next question, which is probably for you, Amanda. Does the new policy establish a framework for dealing with conflicting objectives that may exist within agencies, which may take precedence? Often cost is a key driver, but conflicts with the protection of heritage fabric. So there's a couple of questions in there, but yeah, how does the policy deal with that?
So I think the answer to that is yes, and I think that the way that the policy does that is that it guides agencies on how to consider all options before taking an approach that is going to have an adverse effect on cultural heritage values. So for example, at policy 12, it says that cultural heritage places are not disposed of or demolished without fully exploring viable options for their reuse or alternative compatible uses. So the policy doesn't really say do or do not take a certain approach. It just is trying to ensure that other options are considered in most cases.
Ka pai. Thank you for that. I believe that is all the questions for today. And I'll just pop up what's coming up next. Just one tick, sharing. I just wanted to, sorry, are you seeing the agenda again? It's very hard to, yes, great. I just wanted to, so you just, hopefully you got a list there of the schedule for the webinars. So you can see what's coming up next is principles of asset management and managing change, understanding the legislative framework, protecting heritage and conservation planning. You can see roughly when they will land in terms of timing and the content of those, but the dates will be confirmed, and I understand they're going to go out on different channels, Facebook, the very fact that you're here, so you've obviously got email contact as well, and so that'll come to you, but also keep an eye out in those spaces as well. So those are the things that are coming up over the next wee while into next year. And I think that is us for the day. So just to thank all the presenters today, Amanda, Jamie and Kieran. It was great for you to share your expertise, your knowledge about this important area of how the Crown looks after its heritage places, and in particular for that value that can be surfaced and revealed and reconnected to our community. So ngā mihi kia koutou mō tō kōrero I panaki tēnei kaupapa, ngā mihi. And most importantly, thank you to everyone who's come along. We had a lot of people here this afternoon, so thank you for your time. And we look forward to seeing you at our up and coming webinars coming up in the near future. So ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. And I'll finish with a karakia to finish this off. Unu hia, una hia ki te uru tapanui, kia wātea, te mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua I te arataka tū. Ko ia rā e rongo whakairi ake ke runga kia tīna. Haumi e hui e taiki e. Kia ora tātou.